In order to add to our application's features, it would be nice to display a gallery containing the images of a country's tourist attractions when we are viewing the country's information. In order to implement this, we'll be using user controls. Aside from the controls we've already been using in our application, such as attributes, variables, standard grids, and freestyle grids, GeneXus X also offers us user controls. These are web controls that can be inserted into any GeneXus web object's form, and they will greatly enhance our application's functionality and appearance. Besides this set of user controls, it is important to mention that GeneXus X offers us a user control editor which we can use to modify existing user controls and to create our own user controls which we can incorporate into GeneXus. In order to implement the feature we talked about, we'll be using the Image Gallery user control. So we'll create a web panel and insert a user control into its form. We'll call it Attractions per Country. And we'll display the toolbox, and over here we find the user controls. We'll be using the image gallery, so we'll drag it onto our form. We close the toolbox, and we see what has happened because we dragged the control onto the form. If we open the Objects folder, we'll find a structured data type called Images Data. This SDT was automatically created by GeneXus when we dragged the image gallery onto our web panel's form. Let's stop for a minute and look at some characteristics of SDTs. A structured data type is the GeneXus object that will allow us to define complex data structures. Here we are seeing the set of identifiers. This icon will represent a substructure. This icon will represent a collection, and this icon represents a member, a simple element. If we take a look at this image for a second, here we are looking at an example of a collection of customers. Here we have the collection icon above a customer substructure. Our customer is made up of an identifier and his or her name. So what we have here is a collection of customers, each with an identifier and a name. We'll return to our user control example and see that GeneXus automatically creates the SDT we are looking at. So we have an image collection. This collection is defined over the substructure which represents an image. Each of our images will have an identifier, a path pointing to this image, a path pointing to its corresponding thumbnail, and a caption, the description that will be displayed below each image. In order to load this SDT, GeneXus has automatically created two variables in our web panel. If we click on the Variables tab, we'll see two variables that were also automatically created when we dragged our user control onto the form. The Images Data variable is of Images Data type, that of our SDT, and the Images Data item variable will represent an item, an image that can be loaded into our collection. The question is, how are we going to load this SDT? Well, we could carry out a manual load, or we could define a procedural way of doing it. Let's note that when we insert this control into the form, GeneXus also offers us, if we open the Events tab of our web panel, an example of what a manual load of this SDT could look like. We're going to quickly mention here that we are manually assigning the identifier, the path to our image, its corresponding thumbnail, and the description we want to appear below. And the add method is adding this item to the collection. And so this is an example that GeneXus offers us, a sample of a manual load. But we'll be carrying out a procedural load. And to do this, we'll use a GeneXus object called a data provider. When talking about data providers, we are referring to declarative procedures that are used to obtain the data within a hierarchical structure. The SDT is one of the possible formats for data representation, and it's the format we need in order to load data into our user control. If we look at this image, we can see that a data provider will allow us to transform a set of input data and will be able to display its output in one of these formats. Specifically, we'll be able to display it through an SDT, which is the structure we need in order to load our image gallery user control. This example we have here is showing the declaration of a data provider used to load a collection of passengers. A passenger collection where each passenger is made up of an identifier, his or her name, and a phone number. We'll return to our KB and implement a data provider which we'll use to load our user control. Let's create a new object. This time it will be a data provider and we'll name it DP Attractions per Country. I hit create and we'll carry out a declaration similar to the example we saw on the slide, except that it will correspond to our SDT structure. For our data provider's source, we'll enter our collection's name, which will be images data. Then we type in open parentheses and specify the item's name, which is images data item. We open curly braces and start declaring what attributes we'll assign to each of our SDT's components. The attraction ID attribute will be assigned to the ID element. So I Control-Shift-A and we insert the attraction ID attribute. The attraction image attribute will be assigned to its corresponding image element. But this image component, if we return to our SDT structure, is of character type, and our attraction image attribute is a blob. So in order to make this assignment work, we'll have to use the path to URL, and here we'll insert our attraction image attribute. And to our caption element, we'll assign the attraction name attribute. We've made our assignments where each of our SDT's components was assigned an attribute. So we'll close all of our brackets. And then I add the end parentheses. And we save. And now we'll modify one of our data provider's properties. We'll think about this. If it's the aim of this data provider to transform our information so that we'll be able to display it through our SDT structure, then it would make sense to think that we'll have to somehow associate this SDT with our data provider's output. So to do this, we'll edit our properties. I press F4, and here we can see our data provider's properties. Let's look at the output property. Right now, it does not have an output associated with it, so we'll select our SDT, images data, which will now be associated to our data provider's output. We save the changes, and close the Properties panel. And we still need to determine one thing. As it is right now, this data provider will be loading all of the tourist attractions we've entered into our application. But we need to make sure that we are displaying only the tourist attractions of the country we have selected. So we'll declare the PARM rule. You might remember that the PARM rule allows us to pass parameters between objects, and we'll tell this PARM rule that the country ID has to be passed to the data provider. So let's go to our Rules tab, and we'll declare PARM, parentheses, we'll insert the country ID attribute, and we close the parentheses and add a semicolon. I save the changes, and we still need to call this data provider from our web panel. So we open our Events tab, and let's delete this code. This was the sample code, the suggestion that GeneXus provides for a manual load. So we'll call our data provider using the start event. We select it from here. And you might recall that we have already seen the load event. It's the one that loads the data into our grid. The start event is the first thing to be executed when we open the web panel, so it will be a good place to call our data provider. So we press Ctrl-Shift-O to insert an object, or we can go to the menu, and we'll select our data providers. Dot period, and then call. And now we need to declare our parameters. We'll pass the country ID. So I press Ctrl-Shift-A, insert it, add a comma, and somehow we need to receive the data provider's output. The data provider was associated with our image's SDT, so we'll declare the variable here. So we open the Variables tab, and the image's data variable, which GeneXus created automatically when we dragged our user control onto the form, we can insert it. We close the parentheses and save the changes. So we've already implemented our data provider. We have associated its output to the SDT which GeneXus created automatically when we inserted our user control into the form, and we can now call the data provider from our web panel. In order to fill our requirement, we still need to modify our instance of the Work With Country pattern so that it will display an image gallery showing the tourist attractions when we select a country. So we close this, and we'll open our country transaction. We go to our Work With pattern, and we'll create a new tab, and this tab will be loaded with the web panel's content. But if we want to execute this web panel within another object, it has to be defined as a web component. So we'll open our web panel, Attractions per Country, and we'll edit its properties. We select the type property and set it to component. We save the changes, close the Properties panel, and now we define our new tab. We go to the Tabs option, right-click, Add Tab, and the code will be Attractions per Country, and the caption will be Attractions per Country. For this component name property, we'll select our web panel, which we've defined as a web component, and we'll set its type after we define this. And now we'll set its type to user defined. We save the changes, and in order to indicate that we need the country ID as a parameter, we right-click, Add Parameters. Once again, right-click and we'll define our parameter. We press F4 and set its name to country ID. And hit OK. We save the changes and close the panel. This country ID parameter that our tab will be sending will be received by our web panel. So we'll return to our web panel and we'll declare the parm rule. This is telling it that we will be receiving the country ID. We save, but before we run our application, let's return to our data provider for a minute. Just as we converted our blob attribute in order to associate it with this character element, we need to do the same thing for our attraction ID attribute since it's a numeric. So we press period, toString, choose the function, in order to convert it. Now we can save our changes and press F5 in order to run our application. We select our work with country. We select Uruguay, for example, and we can see our new tab. And if we open this tab, we can see Uruguay's attractions. And if we select Italy, we can see Italy's attractions. If we go back and select France, we can see the attractions for France. Let's return to our KB, and we'll edit the properties of our image gallery user control. This user control admits two types: the table type, which is the default type, the one we have just seen, and the slider type. Let's select the slider type and we'll see how the user control's behavior changes. So I save and press F5 to run our application once again. We open it again and select Uruguay. And note how it's changed, how we are interacting with our images. We can see the description, and let's go back and now let's look at Italy. And for France, we see the same thing. We can interact with our images. In this lecture, we've seen how to implement a user control and load its data using a data provider. We also added a tab to our pattern instance.